Welcome, welcome. I know people are going to file in for just a minute at the door, so I'm going to stall and say welcome a few more times to make sure everybody is here before we get underway. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I'm the editor of My Jewish Learning, and I am delighted to see you all here today. I see some faces that are familiar to me from our Daf Yomi study group, and I see some faces that are new to me. So wherever you are coming from today, and whether you have been to many MJL classes or this is your first, welcome. It is lovely to see you all. Mara, how are we doing? Is everybody in yet?
We have some people still trickling in, but if you're ready to go, I'll do my best to catch them up in the chat.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so happy Purim all. In today's class, we are going to be looking at how the rabbis read the Purim story in the book of Esther, which is strikingly different, I think, than how many of us tend to read it ourselves and in synagogue. And we're going to do that by thinking about the villain or possibly villains of the story. So, Mara, would you go ahead and open the presentation? All right, is everybody able to see that on your screen? Okay. And I invite you to go ahead and comment and discuss in the chat as I present, but I will tell you I'm not going to be monitoring or responding to the chat for the majority of this conversation. Hopefully we will have some time at the end when I can respond to some comments in the chat, but please feel free to discuss with each other in the chat or leave a question for me that perhaps I will be able to get to at the end of the presentation. Either is very welcome. Okay, so who is the villain of the Purim story, right? Now, if you read the Megillah and if you come to synagogue, it's Haman, right? Haman is the undisputed villain of the Purim story. We boo when we hear his name and drown it out. We eat cookies that if you're in America, they're shaped like his hat. And if you're in Israel, they're shaped like his ears, right? And this is also how he's depicted in classical art, right? Here are some depictions of Haman looking pretty slimy, right? Let's look at the next slide too. I've got another one, I believe. All right, there's Esther pointing at Haman, and it's pretty clear. This is the climactic moment, and here is the bad guy. Here he is, and even, let's take a look at the Sistine Chapel, which I have on the next slide. If you look up at the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, you see that Haman is hanging on a what? Can you see what he's hanging on? I can't read the chat. Oh, I can read the chat, actually. He is hanging on a cross. Okay, he's been crucified, which is not a statement that he is Christ-like. Okay, that is not Michelangelo's statement here. It is not a redemptive statement. It is quite the opposite. The point is that crucifixion is the execution method that is reserved for the worst criminals. This is an indictment of him that he's on the cross. Okay, and actually, interestingly enough, the Hebrew text bears this interpretation. It says that he is talui al eish, that he hangs on a tree or a piece of wood. And often in Jewish kids' books and in our discussions of the Megillah, we sort of imagine that he is hung by the neck from a gallows, but there's actually no reason not to translate it as crucifixion. That is a possible translation that the Hebrew could bear. Okay, so in popular imagination and in the way that we ritually enact the Megillah in Shul, Haman is the undisputed villain. And further, because Haman is the undisputed villain, a common read of the Purim story is that it is about the fragility of Jewish life in diaspora, right? We read the Jews as living in Persia in this undefined time. We don't really know when it is. And it's under a relatively benign empire that doesn't really have a negative opinion of them one way or another. And all it takes is this one man, Haman, who worms his way into power. And then out of nowhere, he takes offense at one Jew, Mordecai, who doesn't bow down to him. And suddenly the entire Jewish community is threatened with a massacre. It's a really sobering picture of how anti-Semitism works. If Jews are in a foreign land as a minority, then anti-Semitism can flare up from a tiny spark to a complete conflagration at almost no provocation. But the rabbis of the Talmud read the Megillah quite differently. They read the villainy in the Megillah quite differently. And as a result, I'm going to argue in this talk, they read anti-Semitism quite differently. So let's start with Haman, but we're going to quickly move from him to the other two villains, because the rabbis see three villains in the story. But let's look at Haman. This is what Esther says about Haman's background. It's very little, right? This is chapter 3, verse 1. When we are introduced to him, sometime afterward, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. What is an Agagite? Who are the Agagites? Well, there is biblical precedent to connect the Agagites to Amalek. And the rabbis do this very explicitly. The other source I've brought for you on this slide is from the Targum to Esther, the Aramaic Targum to Esther. What is that? This is an early Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that was known to the rabbis. The rabbis, this was their translation because Aramaic was their first language. And often these Aramaic Targums, there are many of them, often they don't translate literally, but they add information or interpretation as they go. It's not exactly a translation in the way we conceive of a translation, because sometimes they add helpful information, right? And so here's what the Aramaic Targum says at Esther 3:1. It doesn't just say that he's the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. It says Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who's the son of Kada, the son of Kuza, the son of Ali Pilot, the son of Dios, the son of Diosos, the son of Peros, the son of Madan, the son of Balakan, the son of Antimiros, the son of Hadrus, the son of Shegar, the son of Negar, the son of Parmashta, the son of Vaizatha, and who is the son of Agag. We've got like a whole long lineage for him. And now we're going to start recognizing names. The son of Agag, who's the Amalekite king that King Saul spares in the book of Samuel, who's the son of Sumkar, who's the son of Amalek. There's Amalek, the sworn enemies of Israel, who happens to be, didn't you know, the son of the concubine of Eliphaz. Who's Eliphaz? He's one of the so-called friends of Job that comes in for a lot of condemnation in the book of Job. So that's not good blood. Who is the son of Esau, another sworn enemy of Israel. Esau, of course, in the rabbinic mind is connected to Rome. So basically, Haman is related to a lot of bad people, including some very well-known anti-Semites. Right? So now Haman isn't just random fellow in Persia who suddenly rises to power and unexpectedly comes to hate the Jews. His hatred of Jews is very much in his blood, because he is the descendant of Amalek, and he is the descendant of Esau. Okay, let's see what else they do to Haman. All right. The consequence of Haman being descended from these well-known enemies of Israel is that they play up his outsider status in Persia, right? So now we are in the Talmud. Okay, this is, I'm sorry, we're not in the Talmud. We're in the Midrash, written by the same group of rabbis, but it's the Midrash. Rabbi Berechia said, "The Holy One, blessed be he, recorded the redemption of Israel in the Torah, as it is written in Leviticus, if a stranger who is a resident among you shall prosper." They take this verse from Leviticus, and now they are going to interpret this. Who is a stranger who is resident? That is Haman, who became great and rich and became prosperous enough to weigh out 10,000 talents of silver. Haman was an outsider who bought his way into Persian power. He was not a proper Persian. Okay. And what else do they say about him? Actually, I'm going to leave it there. So let's recap. Haman is not just any person. He is a person who is descended from longtime enemies of Israel. He is a descendant of Amalek. He is a descendant of Esau. And he comes to Persia and he buys his way into power. But his hatred of the Jews runs very, very deep in his veins. All right, now let's switch over to Ahasuerus, okay, the king. Here's a picture of him. Looks so terrible, right? Okay, we can see the rosy glow of his drunkenness in his cheeks, but look at him holding Esther's hand and looking concerned and even handsome, right? He is not in our usual interpretation of him. He's for sure, he is for sure incompetent and a fool and a drunk, and those things all make him a great danger to the Jewish people, but we don't necessarily have to read him as inherently malevolent. After all, when Esther reveals herself to him, he doesn't get angry at her deception. He worries about the well-being of her people. So he has sort of a redemptive moment, but the rabbis are going to do something very different with him as well. And to explain what they do with him, I need to give you an incredibly short history lesson. There are 2 dates you really need to know. So Mara, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Major dates in Jewish history. Okay. These are BCE dates, meaning they are before the Common Era, before the year 1. So first, 586 BCE is the destruction of the first temple. The Babylonians destroy the temple in Jerusalem and they exile the leadership of the Jewish community to Babylon. And here they are, as the Psalm says, lying down by the rivers of Babylon and weeping for lost Jerusalem. Jeremiah is probably somewhere in that image. Okay. And about 50 years later, in 539, the Babylonians get their comeuppance because their time on the world stage has come to an end and they are conquered by the Persians. So of course, 539 is later than 586 because we're in negative numbers, right? We're before the year 1. So after the Babylonians destroy the temple in 586, the Persians conquer the Babylonians. And the man who accomplishes that is Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great. And there's a picture of him. He is viewed positively by Jewish tradition because with the rise of the Persians, the Jews, that led the way for the Jews to be permitted to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. The Persians were far less noxious to the Jews than the Babylonians. Okay, so now we know we know Ahasuerus is a Persian king, but the question is, which one is he? Right? Which one is he? So now I've given you a list here on the right of some of the early Persian monarchs, early Persian emperors. This is a contracted list. There's some stuff missing, particularly, so we have Cyrus the Great, who conquered the Babylonians, and he is followed by Cambyses II. After Cambyses II, it actually gets quite dicey, and the empire starts to fissure a little bit, and we have some various competitors for power and short-term reigns. But when the smoke clears, Darius is in charge, and after him Xerxes, and after him Artaxerxes. Now, according to scholars, the name Ahasuerus is the same as the name Xerxes, and so he probably should be. It probably originally meant that the story is about one of these 2 Persian emperors. But the rabbis are going to identify him differently. And the reason they do that is because of things written about Ahasuerus elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so let's look at, did you know that Ahasuerus is mentioned only twice in the Hebrew Bible outside the book of Esther? And I'm going to show you both of those references now. And that will help you understand why the rabbis place him differently. Okay, so these are the 2 biblical references to Ahasuerus outside the book of Esther. All right, here's the first one in the book of Daniel, which makes a remark at the beginning of chapter 9, in the first year of Darius, who was the son of Ahasuerus. Okay, so let's actually, Mara, flip back to the previous slide and see where Darius is in the lineup. Okay, notice that, oh no, backwards, sorry. That was forward. I wanted to go backward. Yep. Nope. Back. Can we go back?
With difficulty, 1 second.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that should just be a back arrow.
It should be, but
Okay.
let's see. You wanted to go here. Thanks all.
Let's go to the first slide that lines up the Persian emperors. There we go. Okay. So these are the Persian emperors. And I told you that Xerxes and Artaxerxes are where somewhere in there is where the scholars think Ahasuerus should be identified with, is meant to be identified with one of them. But we just heard in the book of Daniel that Darius is the son of Ahasuerus. So that puts Ahasuerus somewhere in this lineup above Darius. Probably not as Cambyses II, because Cambyses II isn't Darius's dad, but maybe, depending on how well or not well the biblical author knows the Persian emperors. Okay, let's go back down to the other. Now we can move forward, Mara. Thank you. Sorry for the back and forth. Now let's with the two biblical texts. Yep, we have Daniel and Ezra. There it is. Perfect. Okay, so Daniel says that Darius is the son of Ahasuerus. Ezra makes this comment. This is the other time we hear of Ahasuerus in the Bible outside of Esther. Here, of course, we are learning about the people returning to the land of Israel to rebuild the temple, which was very rocky. It happened in fits and starts. So thereupon, the people of the land undermined the resolve of the people of Judah to rebuild the temple and made them afraid to build. They bribed ministers in order to thwart their plans all the years of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, at the start of his reign, they drew up an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So chronologically, it seems like the order of kings is Cyrus, Darius, Ahasuerus, insofar as that's the order they're mentioned in the text. But an argument could also be made that the order of kings is Cyrus, Ahasuerus, Darius, putting Ahasuerus in between these two kings, because it says the text says that the people were thwarting their plans between these two reigns, and then it says they thwarted the plans during the reign of Ahasuerus. And that would actually harmonize Ezra with Daniel. All right, if you're not following the details, it's okay. But the main point I want you to take away, and you can look at these slides later too, I'm sure we'll send them around, is that Ahasuerus, according to the Hebrew Bible, seems to come much earlier than according to scholars. Much earlier, sometime after Cyrus and possibly even before Darius, if we take Daniel seriously. Okay, so let's flip to the next slide and see what the rabbis think about who Ahasuerus is, right? They seem to think that he's probably either Cambyses II or living somewhere around this time, much closer to Cyrus the Great. He's not Cyrus the Great, but he shortly follows on Cyrus the Great. So this is according to the Bible and the rabbis. Okay, why does all this matter? Why have I spent so much time on these details of chronology that pinpoint Ahasuerus to very early Persia? Why is it important that Ahasuerus is a king in the early years of the Persian Empire? Well, let's see. Let's keep going now. Because now we have placed the whole story of Esther in a time before the temple is rebuilt. And the rebuilding of the temple becomes important background to everything that's going on in the book of Esther. All right. And there's some support in the book of Esther itself. So take a look at Esther 2, verses 5 through 6. This talks about the lineage of Mordecai. Okay, in the fortress of Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who was a Benjaminite who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with by King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so Mordecai is the great grandson of a man who was exiled by the Babylonians. That puts him actually pretty close chronologically to that Babylonian exile, and does actually put him in a timeline where he probably is living around the time that the Jews are starting to rebuild the temple, right? If we imagine that maybe a generation is about 20 years, let's say they had kids young back then, and Kish was already an adult when he went into exile, perhaps, and he shortly after had Shimei. So now we're 20 years into exile, and then he had Yair, say 40 years into exile, and had Mordechai 60 years into exile, and Mordechai grows up. Maybe it's like 80 years into the exile. And now we are in the period of starting to rebuild the temple. Okay, and this will become important background to what the rabbis think is going on in the book of Esther. So let's go ahead and move forward, Mara. Thank you so much. Okay, and now that we've established that Ahasuerus is very early in the chronology of the Persian Empire and is the father of Darius, we can ask, who is the mother of Darius? And Leviticus Rabbah suggests it's Esther, right? The Darius, one of the major kings of Persia, is the son of Ahasuerus and Esther. Another text that solidifies this chronological idea that the book of Esther takes place early in the early years of the Persian Empire as the Jews are rebuilding the temple. Okay, so let's move forward. All right, so now that we have placed Ahasuerus chronologically, let's talk about his ancestry. Okay, and here the rabbis get more creative. There's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that really tells us anything about his ancestry, but the Talmud speculates about it midrashically. This is a creative reading. Okay, so this is from Tractate Megillah, page 11. And Rav is going to make a pun on the name Achashverosh. Achashverosh, says Rav, that is Achiv shel Rosh. The Hebrew expression Achiv shel Rosh, which translates to the brother of the head, sounds an awful lot like the name Achashverosh. Can you hear it? Achiv shel Rosh, Achashverosh. This pun suggests to him, opens for him the following possibility. Rav said, Achashverosh, the brother of the head, Achiv shel Rosh, and therefore also of the same character as the head. The brother of the head, what does that mean? It means the brother of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar. Who's Nebuchadnezzar? Go ahead and tell me in the chat if you know. Who's Nebuchadnezzar? He's the Babylonian king who destroyed the first temple. And Ahasuerus is none other than his brother, right? How do we know that the head is Nebuchadnezzar? They bring a proof text from Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, who is called the head, as it is stated, you are the head of gold. Daniel 2:38. This is the passage when Daniel is interpreting a dream that the king Nebuchadnezzar has, and says in the dream he's represented by a head of gold. So now Ahasuerus, ruling king of Persia, is the brother of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, who destroyed the temple. And therefore it follows that he is of the same character as the head. For he, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, killed the Jews, and he, Ahasuerus, sought to kill them. He, Nebuchadnezzar, destroyed the temple, and he, Ahasuerus, sought to destroy the foundations of the temple laid by Zerubbabel. Okay, so now that we've established Ahasuerus is the brother of Nebuchadnezzar who destroyed the temple, we have the foundation to understand that he inherently hates the Jews. And just as his brother destroyed the Jewish temple, he sought to block the construction of the temple. And they prove that with the very text that we just saw in Ezra a few minutes ago. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote to him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, so now we've established that Ahasuerus is early in the Persian rule. He is of Babylonian descent, and he is the brother of Nebuchadnezzar, the very man who destroyed the temple, and he actually had an agenda to block the reconstruction of the temple. Very different take on this king. Okay, they have more to say about him, and none of it is flattering. So let's go ahead to the next slide. All right. Now, because Ahasuerus is not descended from, say, Cyrus, who is a legitimate king of Persia, but is a Babylonian, it follows that he is a usurper. He is not the legitimate king. And we're in the Talmud again. They are now interpreting the verse in Esther 1:1, Achashverosh, who reigned, the text says, who reigned. Rav says, what does this teach? This teaches that he reigned on his own, by which he means without having inherited the throne. Some say this to his credit, and some say to his disgrace. Some say it's to his credit that there was no other man fit as him to be king. But some say it was to his disgrace, and this is, I think, where the rabbis really want to land on this one, that he was not fit to be king, but he distributed large amounts of money, and in that way, he rose to the throne. So Achashverosh bought his way into power. Not too dissimilar from their depiction of Haman, who also bought his way into power. But he's not really the legitimate king here. He's not even a descendant of a king. Right? Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He was just his brother. He's not in the direct line from Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. So we have Achashverosh is a Babylonian anti-Semite blocking the reconstruction of the temple and a usurper to the throne. All right, we've done a good hatchet job on him and given him a lot of reason to hate the Jews. What about Vashti? What could we possibly say about her, right? She doesn't directly threaten the Jews, does she? She's just the early victim of Achashverosh, and she seems on the surface of the story to just be there to make room for Esther. We have to know why. We have to know why the king is suddenly queenless and is running a beauty contest, and that allows Esther to rise to power. She seems to be more plot device than significant character, but not according to the rabbis. So let's take a look at Vashti. A minute ago, we just talked about how Achashverosh was a usurper and not a true king. And one of the texts that the rabbis pin this interpretation on is in fact Esther 1:1, which opens, it happened in the days of Achashverosh. And notice that he is missing here his title. We don't hear his title until verse 2. In those days, when King Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress of Shushan, right? When you hear the Megillah in Shul this weekend, you can notice in the first two verses, in the first verse, Achashverosh is not king. And then suddenly in verse 2, he gets the title of king. And to the rabbis, that is a hint that he's not legitimate royalty. But Esther, when we meet her the first time, she is Queen Esther, right? We meet her first in verse 9. Queen Esther gave a banquet for the women. She gets the title queen straight off the bat. Okay, so let's hear what they have to say about her background. Go ahead, Mara. We can go to the next slide. All right. More ammunition that strengthens the idea that Vashti is royalty in a way that Achashverosh is not, okay? Notice, here's something else the rabbis notice. Esther 1:5, the king gave a banquet for 7 days in the court of the king's palace. Esther 1:9, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women in the royal palace of Queen Achashverosh. So where's his banquet? It's in the courtyard. Where's her banquet? It's in the palace. Okay, to them, this subtle difference suggests that she has more legitimacy, more royal legitimacy than he does. Thank you, Mara, but I wanted one more text on that slide before we move to the next one. Because the last one is for the rabbis, is this what we see in verse 11, which is when Achashverosh orders her to come dance at his banquet, he orders her to come wearing her royal diadem. Even though he is humiliating her, he wants her to appear with a crown on her head. And to the rabbis, this is also a signal of her true royalty as opposed to his purchased royalty. Okay, let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so what kind of royalty is she? Right? The Megillah doesn't say anything about her background, but that's okay. The Talmud is going to figure it out for us. All right. And again, they are going to do it through Midrash. Rabbi Yonatan interpreted from here. He starts with a verse from Isaiah, and here is the verse. For I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylonia name and remnant and offspring and posterity, says the Lord. Okay, Isaiah says that God says that Babylonian will lose their name, their remnant, their offspring, and their posterity. All that will be taken from Babylonia. What does that mean? Name, says Rabbi Yonatan, is their writing system. Oh, it's giving a thumbs up. Remnant, that is their language. That will also be taken will disappear from the world. Offspring, that is their kingdom. We know their kingdom will fall. And posterity, that is Vashti. Okay, so here we have midrashically inserted Vashti. We have midrashically found a place for Vashti as somehow the culmination of the Babylonian Empire. She is Babylonian royalty, it turns out. They have more to say about that. So let's go ahead and continue to the next slide. All right, still in the Talmud, still on Megillah 10b, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani interpreted, and here we have another verse from Isaiah. Instead of the thorn shall the cypress come up, and instead of the nettle shall the myrtle come up. And it shall be to the Lord for a name, for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. So some sort of prophecy that instead of thorn, which is an undesirable plant, we will have cypress, which is a desirable plant. And instead of nettle, which is also a prickly, undesirable plant, we will have myrtle, which is very sweet smelling. Okay, what does this mean? Instead of the nettle, which in Hebrew is sirpad, this means the nettle refers to the wicked Vashti. Okay, here's another midrash that connects this, that uses this verse from Isaiah to read Vashti as the threat to Israel, right? And how do they get from sirpad, from nettle to Vashti? Because she was the daughter of the wicked Nebuchadnezzar who burned the ceiling, Saraf Refidat, of the house of God, as is written, its top Refidato of gold, from the Song of Songs. So through a series of puns, the rabbis have now used this verse in Isaiah to show that Vashti was none other than the daughter of the son of Nebuchadnezzar. She was Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter. Is Vashti evil? Oh, yes. You will see, Ginger. We're just getting started with her. Okay, so now we have placed her as, unlike Achashverosh, who was the brother of Nebuchadnezzar and not a descendant of the royal line, Vashti is his granddaughter. She's a real princess. Okay, so let's continue. And now the rabbis are going to suggest that Achashverosh was threatened by this, the fact that his wife had more royal blood than he did. All right. So remember, we saw in Esther 1:11 that the king orders Vashti to come before the king wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty to all the people and officials, for she was a beautiful woman. It doesn't say anything here about what else she is wearing. And there's no reason we have to read it that she is naked. But that is exactly how the rabbis read it. A lot of people know this interpretation, but don't realize it isn't actually in the book of Esther. It's a later rabbinic interpretation, right? And here is what they say, moving to the Talmud now. So too, at the feast of that wicked man, Achashverosh, some said, the Median women are the most beautiful. And others said, the Persian women are the most beautiful. And Achashverosh said to them, the vessel that I use, that's a lovely expression to refer to his wife, is neither Median nor Persian, but rather Chaldean, and an ancient people that was absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. Do you wish to see her? And they said to him, yes, provided that she be naked. So it is in the rabbinic tradition that we have this idea that Achashverosh brought Vashti before him naked. And we get the idea that he may have been insecure and had a need to humiliate her, to show her who's boss. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. All right. And according to the rabbis, Vashti knew that she was more royal than Ahasuerus. And it's actually this that made him really angry, right? So they imagine when the Megillah says that the king was very angry, they ask, why was he so angry? It turns out it's not just that she didn't dance for him. Rabbah answers, she sent him a message and said, you son of my father's stable boy. My father drank wine before 1,000 people and did not get drunk, but you are senseless with wine. Okay, she has impugned him as being not royal, right? She's impugned his lineage and a man who can't hold his liquor. All right, and that's the real reason that he was very angry with her, according to the Talmud. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So continuing on in the Talmud, for it is with measure that a man measures to others that he himself is measured. This teaches that the wicked Vashti was punished with being called to dance naked before the king, because she would take the daughters of Israel and strip them naked and make them work on Shabbat. As it is written, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what was decreed against her, and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. Just as she had done, so it was decreed upon her. Okay, the rabbis notice in this verse from Esther 2:1, the language says what she had done and what was decreed upon her. And so they ask, what did she do that brought this punishment upon her? And the answer is that she was cruel to her Jewish slaves. She had a bunch of maidservants who were Jews, daughters of Israel. And because of her deeply ingrained anti-Semitism as the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, she stripped them naked and forced them to work on Shabbat. She humiliated them and forced them to violate their religious precepts. And that is the real reason that she was banished. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead to the next slide. This is, now we're going to step outside the Talmud and look at Midrash Esther Rabbah, which says, Vashti shall never enter the presence of the king Ahasuerus, and let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another woman who is more worthy than she. Why did this happen to her? Because she would not allow Ahasuerus to give permission to rebuild the temple, saying to him, what my ancestors destroyed, you want to rebuild. So this goes even deeper in its interpretation of Vashti's power and anti-Semitism and the reason that she was banished. It's not just that she humiliated and hurt her Jewish maidservants. It's that she actually had the ear of the king and was the one blocking the reconstruction of the temple. She did not allow the Jewish people to go home and rebuild their home, and so she was banished from her home. It's a measure for measure punishment. So they have taken Vashti, who seems like an innocent bystander and mostly a plot device, and somebody that maybe in modern day we can look to as a kind of proto-feminist who refuses to dance for her husband just because he's drunk and his friends want to ogle her, and turned her into a full-on villain, you know, a sort of, I don't know, Cruella de Vil or something, who is actually pulling the strings of power and actually a princess with lots of reasons to hate the Jews because she is the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. The anti-Semitism runs deep with her. She's actually pulling the strings, and her comeuppance is very much deserved. Okay, so I think my next slide should be a recap slide. Did I get through everything? Oh, yeah, one more note. They decide to pile a few more humiliations on her to sort of complete their hatred of her, right? This is Megillah's, this is back to the Talmud. Why didn't she come to dance? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said, this is to teach that she got skin lesions. And a Talmudic source teaches Gabriel came and made her a tail. So part of her punishment was that God afflicted her with these ugly features, and she was too embarrassed to come and dance. It's all part of tearing her down and humiliating her in the text. Okay, so let's recap. When we read the Megillah in Shul, we might see it as a story about one man named Haman who out of nowhere suddenly hates the Jews just because Mordecai the Jew won't bow down to him. And that hatred balloons into a full-scale assault on the entire Jewish community, which seems on its face to be a warning about anti-Semitism being this thing that can spring out of absolutely nowhere for almost no reason in a place where we had no reason to expect it. And from there, the rabbis have an entirely different perspective on the whole story. It's not just Haman, it's all three of these characters. All of them have deep, deep historical familiar reasons to hate the Jews, right? Achashverosh is a Babylonian and the brother of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the temple. Haman is an Amalekite and also a descendant of Esau, two groups of peoples who are sworn enemies of the Jews. And here in the rabbinic mind, when you see Esau, they're thinking Rome too, who obviously that's historically anachronistic because the Roman Empire is not on the world stage yet, but that's the empire they are thinking about because that is the empire they have suffered under so much. And Vashti too is Babylonian royalty, a direct descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the temple. Interestingly, two of these bought their way into power, right? Achashverosh bought his way into power and is a usurper. Haman, we know from the Megillah, bought his way into power. Achashverosh is drunk and easily manipulated, but Vashti is a manipulator, right? She talked him into preventing the Jews from building the temple, and she punished her Jewish maidservants by making them work naked on the Sabbath. And now the whole story gives us a wildly different take on anti-Semitism, right? This portrait suggests that there is really only a few programs of anti-Semitism that kind of keep shape-shifting and moving through history, and that it has very deep roots, and that at certain moments in history, those taproots can be accessed and flare up and become very dangerous, but not that anti-Semitism comes out of nowhere and for no reason because of one ornery, self-involved, egomaniacal villain, but actually because it is lingering behind so many people with power in society, and it runs so deep. It's a totally different kind of view of anti-Semitism when the rabbis read the Megillah. And I want to say one or two more things that I think are kind of interesting about this this reading. One is that it sort of widens the significance of Esther and Mordecai's victory, because now it's not just that Esther and Mordecai have saved this group of Jews in this time and place, but their victory actually has much further repercussions, right? They salvaged the reconstruction of the temple in this reading, right? They're not just saving these Jews, they're also restarting construction on the temple and enabling the Jews to go home, right? We usually think of the Megillah as a diaspora story, but here we have a very deep connection to the land of Israel. They've removed the roadblocks to building the temple, and they have saved not just their community, but all of Jewish history in some sense, right? And similarly, this rabbinic read also now blurs the line between Israel and diaspora. We're used to thinking of Esther as a diaspora story only, but now this reading makes us feel that the fate of what's happening in Israel and the fate of what's happening in the diaspora are much more complicated and interconnected than we might have imagined. And sometimes what happens in diaspora can save what happens in the land of Israel, and vice versa. And sometimes they can threaten as well, that there's much more a sense of interconnection. So I am going to pause there. I just wanted to say, I wanted to also say that a lot of this, before I open it up for discussion, I wanted to give credit in this conversation to this article on thetorah.com by 3 authors, Dr. Malka Simkovich, Dr. Rabbi Zev Farber, and Rabbi David Steinberg, who discuss a lot of the sources that I brought today. They actually have very different conclusions in the article. I brought their conclusion here for you to read. They see this all as a project of basically vilifying Vashti so we can enjoy Esther's rise guilt-free. As I have sort of already said in this presentation, I think it's much deeper than that. And I think there's a lot more going on with the rabbinic struggle with the conception of what anti-Semitism really looks like, how it works, and also Israel-diaspora relations. So I don't follow them necessarily. I don't think this is necessarily wrong, but I don't think this conclusion captures really what's happening in the Talmudic sources. But it is a wonderful, wonderful article in many ways. And in many ways, this talk is in conversation with it. So I want to give credit to this article, which influenced my thinking and is definitely worth your time if you'd like to revisit some of these sources with these 3 scholars and experts. So I just wanted to share that before I open it up to discussion. And one more postscript, and that is the Talmud's idea of real victory is actually embedded in a comment about Haman in Gittin 57b. Right. And ever wondered what happened to Haman's descendants? I never thought about it, but the Talmud did. Right. The rabbis say that Haman's descendants studied Torah in Bnei Brak, and Sisera's, another enemy of the Jews, descendants taught children Torah in Jerusalem, and Sennacherib's descendants taught Torah in public. Right. The ultimate victory over the anti-Semitism of Haman and his ilk is that his children became students of Torah in one of the major centers of rabbinic learning. And that is also, I think, just a really lovely, positive place to end this, at least my portion of the presentation, but this has allowed us about 10 minutes for conversation if you would like to. So as I mentioned, it's a little too much for me to monitor comments while I'm trying to talk and keep track of my slides. But Mara, if there's anything in the comments that needs addressing, I'd be happy to try. And also, if I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this rabbinic read. Does it make you sad that that you've always thought of Vashti as a feminist icon and they do such a hatchet job on her, right? What are your thoughts? Please share with me, and I'm happy to talk for a little bit.
Okay, so we have Stephen Burke and Bev A who have their hands raised. We do have 12-ish minutes left, so we do ask for a short, concise question or thought so we can have as many people as possible participate. So we'll start with Stephen.
Okay. Stephen, nice to see you.
Yes, nice seeing you too. It is a very absorbing interpretation, and liturgically and religiously it's very interesting. Historically, I don't buy it. I've done substantial reading in the history of early history of Persia and their conquest of Babylonians. There's no indication in any literature I've read that there was ever any intermarriage between the Babylonian and Persian royal families at the time of the conquest. The rabbis may have been thinking about much later, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, and he did marry a Persian princess and had his subordinates marry Persian noble women as well. But there's no indication this ever happened back centuries before that when Persia conquered Babylonia, and I think something like that probably would have been noted in the histories.
Yeah, and Stephen, I'll do you one better. None of this is historical, right? The book of Esther, there's no historical substantiation for pretty much anything in the book. It seems to be entirely fiction. fiction. So yes, all the things the rabbis are saying don't make sense historically. The Bible seems a little confused about the chronology of the Persian monarchs, and also the Book of Esther itself is very much understood by scholars to be a fiction. So I think you're right to point that out, and I think the place to focus is on what it means for the rabbis, not could this possibly have really happened, because no, and then we have no evidence that there was a Persian king who married a Jewish queen either. Right. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Whether it's real or not, the archetypes, it's very helpful to me, and I really appreciate what you've spoken about today. I see very much in this parallels to today, and also parallels to my personal being triggered by something, and all my ancestral burdens, as well as my own, come up. And if I had the power, I would act them out, just like those in power are acting out. So for me, it's a great learning today. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a thoughtful comment. I appreciate it.
We'll go to Anne.
Hi, thank you for taking my question, and thank you for a wonderful, interesting presentation. I think that you said that the reason Vashti was, that in this interpretation, the reason that Vashti was exiled was because she wouldn't let the Jews rebuild the temple.
Yes, there is a suggestion of that in the Talmud.
So why would Ahasuerus care about that? Why would he care? Why would he want the temple to be rebuilt?
What?
Why would he banish her for that? Why would he care if the temple was rebuilt?
No. The banishment was God sort of manipulating the system, and Ahasuerus banished him because God used that as an instrument to punish her.
Okay.
He wasn't banishing her about that. He was following her about that. She leads him around by the nose. Right. So she leads him around the nose, but God orchestrated her banishment as punishment for doing that. Very often the rabbis read the way humans punish each other as being somehow, or afflict each other as being somehow orchestrated by God as punishment.
Okay, like God hardening Pharaoh's heart.
I
mean, God,
yeah, I think we got that connection, perhaps. Yeah.
We'll go to Irene and then Aaron.
Hi, Irene.
Hi, this is great. Thank you very, very much. I was just gonna comment on what the other person was saying about getting triggered with all of this. Like, it's almost like, wow, like how come we take it on? Excuse me, we take it in so much, we feel it. A lot of us, and it's not just me and that. Like, I've heard a lot of people saying this, like a communal kind of, like, wow, but it's big.
Mm-hmm.
How do you interpret that? And I don't know if this is coming from a female who's very sensitive, or because other males might be also feeling this when you're listening to all of this. You're like, you get so revved up in the emotion, and then you feel like the pain of the people that were enduring this, and
the previous comment I thought was talking about how awareness of our own ancestries can sensitize us to things happening in the world today. That's how I understood it anyway. Is that what you are also talking about, Irene? Or are you talking about something else?
Irene, you're muted.
both ways, actually, both ways. That something in our past will remind us, like, oh yeah, and then something from here will bring back our past, and then it just opens up a big, with everything going on and stuff like that. I'm sorry if I'm not asking the question right.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and profound point.
It's very powerful to learn these kind of things. It's very like shocking, a lot of the stuff
Yeah.
that
That many of us, our histories have a hold over us and
Yeah.
influence in ways that we aren't always conscious of.
Exactly, and then they just pop
Yeah.
up and seem larger than they should, and we're like, yeah.
And I will not weigh in on whether they should or shouldn't, but moments will trigger these things in us that run deeper than we perhaps realize. I think that that is
What
part
is
of
that?
the rabbis.
Do you know what that is?
I think that's human nature, no? I'd love to hear what other people think, but I think Judaism especially is so invested in historical memory and, you know, of there are many different traditions in the world, but Jews are almost obsessive, we might say, about historical memory and knowing our past and rehearsing our past every year liturgically and ritually, and that is to put we intentionally make it part of our DNA practically, I think. But I think you could also say that there's some human nature to that. But I'd love to hear what other folks have to say. Maybe if you would like to respond to Irene's question in the comments, we'd love to hear what you have to say too.
We'll go to Marcy and Naomi.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I think that the rabbis felt that God was not in this story. And I think they needed to bring God in some way. And putting a lot of pressure on Vashti, I also think that was too extreme. She's not that heavy of a character to take that burden on. She appears so briefly. And she does something important to the plot of the story. She's an important character, but she's not a big character. And if you look at the scroll of Esther as a story, as fiction, she's really good in that character. And to pile all this stuff on her, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she prevents the temple from being built, and this and this and this, and she's a vessel of God. And it's just too much. It's bad writing. It's bad storytelling. She's not, that's not good. It's not, it doesn't work. And I think that it's asking too much of her. It's enough for her to say, I won't dance.
Yes.
It's enough. Dayenu.
I hear you. It doesn't feel like that's what the writer of the Megillah has in mind, to make Vashti a villain on par or even over and above Ahasuerus and Haman, which makes her kind of an interesting counterpoint to Esther, right? Esther is the hero, possibly even over and above Mordecai. And now we have Vashti, this woman whose evil and power has just swollen in the hands of the rabbis. But that, I think, Marcy, is the beauty of Midrash, is that they take these liberties and they turn the story inside out, and it does really fascinating things with the story and makes us think about it in whole new ways, even if it feels like literally the story doesn't bear all of that interpretation. And as you said so beautifully, it does solve another problem in the Megillah, which is the absence of God. Right? Famously, the Megillah doesn't evoke God explicitly. People think, the rabbis thought maybe there's a hint in the word makom when Mordecai says to Esther that maybe help will come from makom acher, from another quarter, from another place. And makom is one of these rabbinic names for God. But it really, at the Peshat level, at the literal level, the Megillah doesn't evoke God. But this whole apparatus that the rabbis have constructed with these 3 villains instead of the one, and making this sort of so involved with Babylonia and Nebuchadnezzar and the rebuilding of the temple, it makes it feel much more that God is pulling the strings here, and brings it more perhaps in line with the rabbi's theology. I think that's definitely something, and I'm glad you highlighted that for us.
Okay, I did say we would go to Naomi. We have just a minute left, and I do want to share some other exciting programming we have going up. coming up. So Naomi, if we could squeeze in just one more question.
Sure.
Okay, it's a comment, because first of all, you've showed very nicely how the rabbis have been demonizing Vashti, and they've demonized Haman as well. But I just wanted to bring to your attention where the rabbis actually have chosen not to demonize Haman. And I assume that you know this particular source, but in the Midrash, there's actually a very, very interesting source, which is that that some of Haman's descendants actually studied Torah, and because they studied Torah, they had some descendants who ended up being the teachers of Hillel, the elder. And it's very interesting. Why would the rabbis have a source like that? And I think it's to show, to sort of, okay, we want to demonize, we want to completely get rid of our enemies, but perhaps we don't have to totally destroy them. It's almost an anti reaction to the general trend. So I think it's important to bring in two sides, because on the one hand, they utterly do demonize. There's a binary. There's the good people and the bad people. But even among the good people, even among Esther, they sometimes have negative things to say about her as well. So I think we have to be a little bit careful when we're looking at sources, and I think you've done a fabulous presentation here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. I actually did bring that source a little bit clipped at the very end of the presentation, and I suggested a different interpretation of it, though I like yours. I suggested that this was not a redemption of Haman, but an ultimate victory over Haman. In other words, that Haman's descendants become scholars of Torah at B'nai Brak does not mean that they have redeemed Haman in some way, but that rather Haman's hatred of the Jews has been converted in later generations to the Rabbinic Academy and overcome in some grand victory. But I like your interpretation too. And yes, you also point out that it is a little dangerous to say the rabbinic interpretation, because of course the rabbinic mode of reading text allows for the idea that there are 70 faces of Torah and there are many possible interpretations, and we don't necessarily have to harmonize everything that the rabbis say together. They can say things that contradict each other, and they can turn the story and see different things in it that don't necessarily mesh well together. So this is one set of texts and one reading, but not necessarily meant to represent the whole of everything the rabbis had to say about these characters or this story. But I think it's a very interesting reading of it that I was pleased to be able to share with you today and hear your very thoughtful comments and questions. I always learn a lot from you guys too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all. We will follow up with the source sheet and the recording of this in case you'd like to rewatch it. And also we will share details on our upcoming Megillah reading, which is happening this Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time. If you haven't gotten enough Purim learning, we'll be reading the Megillah and also hearing some insights from Rabbi Moshe Steigman. So we hope to see you then, and be well. Oh, Rachel, go ahead.
I have one more thing to say, which is, Mara, in the materials that we send out after this class, I'd like to also send you one article on the Midrashic sources on Vashti that goes a lot farther and a lot deeper than the things I have said here today, and is very interesting. It's actually on My Jewish Learning. I published it a few years ago. It's by Shira Eliezer. So if you are curious to learn more, I encourage you to read that piece as a follow-up to this class.
All to say, check your email. And,
check your email.
An early Chag Sameach. Happy Purim.
Yeah, Purim Sameach, everyone.